Last time we spoke about the divine order, the covenantal law, Abrahamic tradition, and it gave us something of a theoretical foundation for what a flourishing, successful society might look like. Today, of course, when we look around, we see dysfunction, we see problems, we see all sorts of disharmony manifesting at all sorts of levels. When you read the news, maybe you do or don't, you look around the world, you just are aware of the things that are going on, and you did touch on some of these things last time. I'm just really interested maybe to start off here to get your a characterization of how you see the problem, because everyone observes things through their different frames. Everyone talks about the various levels of crisis that people are in today. But what's your perspective when you look around? How do you characterize the situation of human beings in the world today?
It's a big question in the sense that when you're thinking about the problem as well as potential solutions to that problem, and when I mean that, I'll explain what I mean in a moment. But when you're thinking about that stuff, you're talking about something really, really complex. And the nature of complex problems is that they often require a concomitant complexity of solutions to them. Now, when I say that problem, because you just listed quite a few, right? There are many problems or many crises that exist. But do they exist in isolation is the question. Are they independent of one another? Or are they a set of interconnected problems where one affects the other, right? So the first kind of, I guess, approach would be looking at this from the perspective of polycrisis, where you've got a number of different problems. And then you have what's known as a meta crisis, which you and I have discussed quite frequently, which is the nature of a number of different problems, but they're all interconnected. So the idea of just fixing one thing doesn't speak to a solution, because the minute you do that, you change something else. Not only that, just fixing this is a bit like you've got a lake with two streams. Fixing one stream doesn't stop the water coming in from the other one. So what you require is an overarching solution, a meta solution to a meta crisis. And that's why I speak about the Abrahamic tradition as offering us a covenantal order, right, to address the meta crisis. So if you're thinking about meta, it's more like an engine, and an engine has loads of moving parts. Saying I'm just going to tighten one bolt here doesn't mean the engine is fixed. If you've blown a gasket, for example, there's more to it than just fixing a bolt or a nut here. And that's a lot of what we as humanity seem to be doing at the moment, amongst the various threads and groups of humans, right? Whether you talk about Muslims and, I don't know, Islamic finance, right? Or you're talking about socialists speaking to particular policies. I don't mean to kind of say that any one of these groups are a monolith. Obviously, within them, you have variant sets of people. But just speaking, as a general overview, everybody seems to be speaking to one thing, right? You've got people like, let's say, Gary Economics, right? He speaks to the idea of taxation and the billionaire class. But how did they become billionaires? And is it the idea of, oh, they're just people out here who have amazing skills? Because he happened to be one of the people from the working classes who seeped through. But that the order is legit. It's just really bad that the billionaires became billionaires. And I don't intend to speak to that. My point is the approach isn't really a holistic approach. All right, you're going to, let's say, tax the billionaires. But what about mental health? That still exists. What about xenophobia and racism? That still exists. And so on. So that's not going to lead to social stability. All right, you've just got a bit more money in the public coffers. Okay, but the kind of decisions that politicians are making, not just on taxation, but across the board, the solution to that isn't more money. And again, he's still speaking to that. So he's still speaking from within that order. Now, I think the first thing to understand, and I'm going to give it a name, and that name isn't a name I've made up. It's actually a name that was made up by the very people who created the order. The order that we live in at the moment, right, is the neoliberal order. That's like the name of it. And it's a political, cultural, and economic system that has dominated the world, probably since World War II, but more so since the 1970s. So, when people use, oh, the New World Order, all of these kind of rhetorical frames, terms, what they're essentially speaking to is this: the order that we live in, is very new. It is not natural. It's not just how things happen. It's a very calculated and devised way of organizing societies, right? Which I'll come to very briefly, and what that does. But fundamentally, it's built on the idea that markets are not people and like governments that represent them, right? So an expression of the people. It's the markets that should be the primary mechanism for organizing society. Yeah. Now, when I used to hear things about, on this topic 20 years ago, when I was much younger, I used to think, oh, this is just socialist talk, or I don't know, Marxist talk or capitalist talk. I think just as a layman, we don't appreciate this approach to thinking, which in my opinion is the starting point of looking at the problem. Not that money dominates everything, but it is an ideology which ascribes to not necessarily money, but consumption, resources, and the ways in which, let's call them elites, have framed ways of thinking. Now, when we're talking about neoliberalism, what we're talking about is the idea that the markets are the primary mechanism by which we organize society and regulate society. It's not just a set of policies, it's a way of thinking about human life, about freedom, and about value. Now, it comes from this notion that, and these are really key points, all right? So I'm not just with a scattergun approach, just coming out with rhetoric. These key points are the points that will help you to frame it. Not you, because you've got a PhD, but just generally, people who are being introduced to the topic for the first time, right? So you have individual freedoms within competitive markets. Neoliberalism teaches that human well-being is best advanced through that. Again, through individual freedom within competitive markets. Okay. When I talk about the neoliberal order, not just an ideology or a system, I'm talking about a global system that's shaped by this belief, by this ideology. A system in which, and this is a really key point, that markets, finance, corporate interest, they have the dominant influence over government, over culture, our everyday culture and everyday life. Yeah. So the kind of things that we do or we get up to is not to be taken for granted, right? There is a reason why we do those things. There is a reason why we question what we question. The questions that we ask, they are all coming from a paradigm. Nothing is neutral. That's my point here. Now, as an order, it's hegemonic. And what does that mean? It means that it's not just a policy set, oh, just do this and do that, or the government's regulated this law and this law. It's a governing rationality, that shapes how people think about themselves and they think about, the world. It has two main components: an economic logic, which is everything is financially measurable, tradable, and optimizable for financial gain. Everything. So that's the economic logic. And, we can discuss the problem with that logic in a moment. And the anthropological logic to it is that humans are viewed primarily as rational self-maximizers. So just more. In Arabic, we might call that ziyada, right? Now, the logic of this, to anybody who knows Revelation, the problem, to this, of anyone who knows Revelation, is very, very clear. So the idea of, for example, maximizing. What does God say? Alhaakum at-takathur. Takathur means maximization, just more and more. And how does God describe that problematic view? Alhaakum, it diverts your attention. The question is, diverts your attention from what? A lot of people think, oh, it's just from the afterlife. No, there's more going on there. And just even the idea that the markets are the driver for this ideology. Very famously, the final messenger of God, may his legacy endure, is that he said that the worst places are the marketplaces and the best places are Masajid Allah. So the masjid. Not today's modern mosque. It doesn't mean that. It's more talking about it as an institution. And a lot of at least Muslims and others, they misunderstand the hadith. They think the Prophet's talking about it as a place. Just don't be in the marketplace, don't be in the mall, be in a mosque. No, he's talking about these as institutions. Why? Because if you live in the marketplace, whether that's, an ancient market or it's talking about the modern market, in both senses, there is a logic. There's a reason people are there, and that can subsume you. And what is a marketplace? About trading goods and services. So the idea of trade, maximization, right? Seeking the biggest profit margin you can, going home with acquisition. If that starts to dominate your mindset, it's a cancer that spreads into other realms of your life, right? Now, where anthropologically humans are viewed primarily as rational self-maximizers, what do humans become? Humans we're talking about now. Consumers, investors, entrepreneurs of the self, and so on. And this is why it's a totalizing worldview. That's why it is. Think about what it does. It colonizes your ethics, your education, even your social relationships. You start to look at friendships, spousal relationships, your neighbors, friends, guests, in that very, from that very logic. And that's why it becomes really, really problematic. Yeah. So that's where we are. That is the shortest kind of summary I can give. The shortest one I can give, in order to explain what it is and why it's problematic. At least intuitively, people hopefully can start to see what the problem is there.
No, sure. And I think that very useful introduction will have resonated, with a lot of with viewers. And there are things which people are familiar with. And like you said, they kind of intuitively are familiar with as well, because the idea that there is an internal kind of conflict between inside a human being who deep down knows who or she really is and what he or she is really about on the one hand.
There would be a question, do they know?
Well, no, meaning...
Is this so totalizing and conditioning that they're so deeply socialized that nobody even knows who they are anymore, what humanness is, or in Arabic would say insaniya even is?
No, sure, I understand. But to the extent that somebody might be, to use maybe sort of a new age language, in touch with their true self kind of thing, to the extent that somebody might be in touch with that. And then obviously there's various levels and layers of that, maybe darkness or that clouding or covering that has taken place. But yeah, people experience that conflict, and the conflict that you're in a system which you haven't fully understood, and most people, like you have indicated,
the matrix.
It takes a while to fully appreciate like the actual context that you're functioning within. So they feel that tension. People will then be interested to understand, okay, well, what does the alternative look like, and how do we move to that alternative? And I think it would be useful, if possible, just if you can do a bit of a compare and contrast between what you have just mentioned, that are key facets of this neoliberal kind of order, and by contrast, and what are the key facets of a divine covenantal kind of order that show clearly, essentially, what those differences are. Because some of what you said, for example, the totalizing part of it, or the way that ethics are colonized, and et cetera, those components don't seem to be, they are true of what the current system, but they don't necessarily, I don't see them as problems in and of themselves, because somebody could similarly say, well, even
that's because you're an agent of the
matrix. But someone could say, well, reasonably, I think, unless you obviously tell me if I'm wrong, even the divine covenantal order is totalizing.
100%.
Yeah, so meaning
I wasn't problematizing something being totalizing.
Yeah, fine.
If I could just make a point on that.
Yeah.
So one of the problems that I've always had, it's not a problem. I don't mean to problematize it. It's natural in society. But one of the challenges that I have, talking to lots of different people about basically the same issues, is the nature of how people rationalize things or how they understand things. So that's why this is a point, is the idea of binary logic or binary reasoning. If I'm criticizing one thing in one context, it doesn't mean that now is delegitimized across all contexts or in every given circumstance. Sure. Not necessarily. Like, picking your nose is really not good in a social setting. But if you've got asbestos stuck up your nose, then you really need to start digging, right? So in and of itself, it's a problem. Most things are only a problem within particular contexts. They're not necessarily evil within every context. A really good example that perhaps will resonate with, I don't know, Jews or Muslims is the idea of consuming pork. Yeah. So in a general context, where you have food, where you have drink, there are alternatives. It's not a very healthy thing to do. That's why God legislates against it. But what does God say? If you're dying, right? If you are not driven by impulses but by necessity, yeah, فَمَنِ اضْطُرَّ, whoever is forced, and that's a different story. Then death or a ham sandwich. Come on, right? So that's one. Number two, just because on one hand somebody says this isn't something to do, it doesn't mean the opposite of it is always true either. So in this sense, it's always good to do, or vice versa. Again, the notion of nuance in reasoning is really, really important here.
Sure, no, makes sense. But can you take us through this kind of compare and contrast then?
Yeah.
Because we did speak about it to a certain degree last time, but now that you've set out the kind of key facets of this neoliberal order, it would be really helpful to do a bit of a compare and contrast of what the better alternative is.
So, of course, I'm just being incredibly simplistic about the neoliberal order. I don't want to sit here and it turns into a podcast about that because you're highly pragmatic. So you're like, okay, but what do we do on the ground? But I kind of thought about it this morning. I thought, you know what, let me make just a few notes to keep this part of the podcast really, really precise and clean. And then we can take it wherever you want to take it. So I had in a few bullet points, like as a bullet point numbered. So the foundational worldview, what's the difference? Just a compare and contrast as you asked. Source of authority. Now, in a neoliberal order, the source of authority becomes market rationality and human preference. Now, someone will say, well, that's what's wrong with human preference. Well, as we know, people can prefer very bad things. People can be driven by greed. I'm not saying that's their natural disposition. I believe the natural disposition of humanity is good, right? But it can be corrupted easily. Humans sometimes, which is against them, is that they can be naive. So in their assumption of the good, people can come along and manipulate them, manipulate their interests, manipulate their perception. Right? So that's where it becomes problematic. Where is the safeguard to that? But in the neoliberal order, there is no safeguard. Human preference, full stop, whatever it is. Right? A market rationality where everybody's a consumer. Ziyada or takathur just regulates everything. So that's one. In the Abrahamic Covenantal order, God's sovereignty is the source of authority and the revealed covenantal law. Yeah, and we'll discuss that later because some people think of that as some really strict, conformed way, and that's not. It's a framework of thinking. It's not just do this and do that. And unfortunately, even some religious people, and clearly I'm not a religious type, it's more existential for me, as in much more overarching than a bunch of rituals in a corner or just some isolated, this is a law. Well, no, it doesn't really work like that. I do see that as a very regressive way of looking at anything in life, to be honest, let alone God's law. But it's a framework of thinking in which God has placed pillars, but we'll come to that later. But God's sovereignty and the covenantal law, which gives us, like the neoliberal order, it gives us a framework of thinking. Within that, there is choice, there's freedom and so on. And that's the same as the neoliberal order. In as much as it sells you human preference and choice, it limits the choices that you can make, but it just takes your choices in a certain direction. Everything does. So even to the point, this naive idea that there is unlimited freedom, the West allows me unlimited freedom. And when I say the West, I mean the neoliberal order. I've always had a problem with the term West, but I'm using it. I'm trying to bring that to the fore for people.
Not geographical as
much
as
it's not geographical. It's more ideological, right? And that's not to say, again, that there is an Eastern way. We don't mean that at all. So it's not East versus West or East versus the global South. I don't mean it like that. But just geographically talking about that place, that's where that ideology stemmed from. So, in that, you have the marketplace, market rationality, and human preference. In the Abrahamic Covenantal order, you have God's sovereignty and the law that a sovereign would give. Okay, human nature. Yeah. So this is the foundational parts of the worldview. Human nature is seen as autonomous, self-interested individuals, seeking or pursuing utility and personal gain. Whereas in the covenantal order, human nature is where you are an agent, an intellectual, moral agent, but you're bound by a covenant with the Most High, and you're accountable to the sovereign and to the people you live with. Yeah, whether that's a village, whether it's a town, city, a land, a country, however we want to look at it. The meaning of life. according to neoliberal order, maximize choice, wealth, and pleasure. Yeah, very much utilitarian, secular utilitarian, that perspective. Whereas the Abrahamic Covenantal order, it's about fulfilling your covenantal obligations. It's about truth. It's about fairness. It's about stewardship. Yeah, being kind and gracious. All of those things that are required for people to live together under God and give gratitude. That's what it speaks to. We discussed that in the first podcast. The idea of freedom. In the neoliberal order, it's freedom from constraint, full stop. So don't tell me what to do anywhere, anytime. There should be no strictures, which is a mirage. Of course, there's strictures. Nobody can sit around tomorrow and say, well, I'm not paying taxes. You end up in prison. You physically, from financial strictures, you end up into a physical one, right? But there's this, again, nearly everything is a mirage, right, that people claim. But freedom in the Abrahamic covenantal order is freedom for good. It's freedom to do good, right? People use these terms righteous and so on. I'm not problematizing them, but sometimes they can be a bit nebulous. But freedom to do good things and the freedom to have the discipline to live well, to live fair. We have to talk about fairness because we don't live on our own, on top of a mountain somewhere. We live amongst other people. So the idea of fairness is the idea of everyone having an equal right to pursue resources. And I'm sorry, they don't have that, at the moment. But pursuing the resources they need in order to achieve what? Money? No, contentment. What makes one person content isn't the same as the other, right? But to pursue contentment in a way that they can recognize God's graces on them and give gratitude to the Most High. And then there's the moral grounding. So in the foundational worldview of the neoliberal order, what you have is a relative, kind of moral grounding that shifts with social trends and consumer demand. Whereas in the covenantal order, it's principled. It's, truth and fairness and justice have an intrinsic value. So that's kind of like more the foundational worldview. The economic philosophy, the idea of economic philosophy. One, ownership. Neoliberal order, private, absolute, and a property is an extension of self. Whereas the Abrahamic covenantal order, things you own, you don't actually own. It's just long-term lease until you're dead. Because the minute you're dead, you don't own it anymore. You're gone, right? So therefore, you have there's a sense of stewardship. You take care of what you have. Wealth is a trust from God. It's a resource from God. And it's there to serve needs. So anything beyond your need, the idea, again, this goes back, I guess, to the modern conception of should there be billionaires? Why do you have things you don't need? Yeah. The market ethic. The market ethic in the neoliberal order is profit maximization. Yeah. And the idea is that it's moral if it's legal. Yeah. But you can see how that ties in a moment to the whole idea of law. Whereas in the Abrahamic covenantal order, profit should serve fairness, dignity, and social balance. The view of labor in the neoliberal order, workers, they're a cost that you have to minimize. Whereas in the Abrahamic covenantal order, workers are your partners. They're moral partners. Yes, skilled sets. If I've put in 10 years in being good at something, obviously the value of that is going to be more than somebody who's put in 10 minutes, right? So we're not going to get paid the same. Nobody's saying that. But even then, you're still working together to achieve something, right? And you want to dignify people. So the idea that, yes, you should exist on £2.50 an hour and I'll exist on 250 grand an hour. Where is that dignifying people? And then you have debt and finance, right? And then this speaks to economics and macroeconomics. The idea that credit expansion is the engine of growth. Now, that requires some kind of depth and detail. I'm not sure if we're going to get to discuss that here. But fundamentally, that's the case. How is money created, right? Money is created.
Just on that, well, at the time that I think this podcast will be released, prior to it, there will have been a series of 4 that all focus on this issue of money creation, sound money.
Oh, you mean here?
No, as in I'm in the midst of recording.
Not here, as in, but you're going to discussing it with someone else.
Yeah, because we've got this kind of lag time between the timing of this.
That's a violation. So you didn't discuss it with me. You discussed it with someone else.
No, well,
the economist in me is waiting to come out.
No, sure.
I'm joking.
Sure. No, but So anyway, no, but
okay, people, make sure you watch it.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, so but I no, definitely it's a very because they would say that whilst obviously you've mentioned it as a point amongst many points here, obviously the people who coming from that particular angle of the economics and financial angle, which is so central, of course, to what you've mentioned about the neoliberal kind of the way, absolutely the creation of money, the fiat system, credit expansion, etc., and how that erodes value, but not just material value, but value across the board, essentially. Is
I think one of the
absolutely
problems
central
is
to see that kind of ruse for what it is.
100%, but it's still a tool of the system. It is not the system. And I think when I'm not talking, I have no idea what you guys are going to talk about, but again, it's trying to, when I've spoken to other people about it, they think solving that is going to solve the problem. I'm like, cousin, you're still going to have war.
Yeah, that's
You're still going to have racism. You're still going to have social dysfunction in society. So the idea that we can fix an economic problem, it goes back to this idea: people only care about money. You sort out their money, everything else is settled. Rubbish.
The great analogy for that is that whack-a-mole, right, at the fairground, right? Because you hit this one, and then another thing comes up. So no, I definitely get that. Although it's
but it is definitely an
amongst
important
the things,
aspect.
it's probably a very chunky one.
Definitely, because it ties into the whole idea of markets, right? Which is based where neoliberalism is coming from. But in that Abrahamic Covenantal order, what you have is that debt is limited. Because it's absurd when you think about it. Our society, our economics, the trading of goods and services and the exchange of those things, it only works if somebody needs to spend money they don't have. Just the logic of that is absolutely bizarre. But that's what the entire economic system is based on. That's how money is created in the first place. Whereas in a completely different universe, the Covenantal order, debt is limited and it's regulated. You're not trying to encourage people to spend what they don't have, nor are you putting them in a position where they can't get what they need, just basics. And then you're celebrating that and making it the basis of your economy, right? And that's where the whole riba discussion comes in, because riba encourages a credit expansion as the engine of growth. Does that make sense?
Could you maybe just elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, you're going to have a podcast on it.
No, but
how
now
are
that
you
you've said
guys
it,
going to have a podcast and not discuss it?
now that you've said it, so what I heard you say there was riba encourages credit expansion for the sake of growth.
Yes, as an engine for growth.
No, sure, okay, fine. No. So the way you.
So riba is a macroeconomic problem. I think.
Sure.
So when people come to
just
me,
the way you expressed it, I felt that you were saying that was a good thing, but then no, I think it was. I think you're so cheery today. I don't know what's going on.
Is this your handsome face? So that's that. Okay. So we've discussed the worldview. We've discussed economic philosophy. The third point is political and legal structure. Neoliberal order. It's minimal. And it exists to protect markets and property. That's literally what government exists for. Yeah. And we see it every day. We see it with policies. We see it in the directions that governments take. Whereas in the covenantal order, the state role, we're talking about here the state role. The state role is that it's there to be a servant to the people, right? It's a steward over the people in order to serve them, right? To ensure fairness, to protect vulnerable people, to enforce the covenantal framework that doesn't allow the corrupt and the elite to use people for their own growth. Yeah? Okay, the law itself. In the neoliberal order, it's just instrumental. Yeah? Whatever Parliament decides. And who is Parliament? Parliament is made up of in Britain, several hundred people. You have a House of Lords and House of Commons, but just speaking to the Commons, several hundred random folk that have been voted in. It's just how good their marketing was and what they spoke to. So if, for example, society is going extreme right, or it's turning racist, right, or xenophobic or genocidal, as long as you speak to the genocidal nature of people, that's fine. Now, yes, that's not to say every politician is like that. But by and large, if your mission is to sell to the consumer, what's your marketing strategy going to be? Find out what the consumer wants, and the consumer is never wrong. Right? And that's why you see what's happening is based on that logic. Yeah. So it's whatever Parliament or whatever the market will allow. Whereas in the covenantal order is derivative. Yeah, it ought to align with certain principles that we've agreed as a society, rational principles that we've agreed as a society ought to be the basis of how we want to live and interact with one another.
If you don't mind me just
Go for it.
getting to pause there, because obviously somebody might hear what you've just said and think, I could imagine someone thinking, so what does he think about democracy then? Meaning, can you have what does a political framework look like in under this Abrahamic Covenantal order? would it be democracy in the way that we have it? That actually people do put themselves forward. We vote for them, meaning they have to appeal. They are still appealing to people. It's just that, our principles are more aligned now. So now we're getting the right people in. Meaning people get the leaders they deserve ultimately. Essentially, is that what you're saying? And therefore, it's not the framework that's the problem, but again, it's again the issue where the hearts and minds of the average citizen is the way people are thinking and feeling, and therefore, essentially, you're voting for sort of self-harming policies and people essentially.
The problem with the discussion of democracy in the populist realm is that it's based on nonsense.
Okay.
And why is that nonsense? Because what people use, it's not people, it's the way the conversation has been framed by the neoliberal elites. What is democracy? The idea that you get to choose. Again, it goes back to choice, which is brilliant, but who's choosing what and how? So if, for example, in Britain, we say, oh, we have a democracy, do we? Many Western political theorists, this is me with my political theorist hat on, many political theorists, right, just academics, they're like, there's no democracy, there's a polyarchy. So there is a say in certain things, but it's not a direct democracy. You don't get to choose everything.
Well, what is a polyarchy?
Right? So a polyarchy is where, for example, a representative democracy, which is the one we live in, we don't choose our leaders. We choose our local MP. But a bunch of dudes sit down and dudettes, they sit down together and they decide who the prime minister is going to be. We don't get a say in that.
Mostly dudes.
Right? Mostly dudes, right? A few dudettes. But they decide. They decide who your leader is going to be. Who's deciding on the policies? You're not. Yeah, they sell you some policies, right? Depending on when this is released. Like at the moment, Rachel Reeves. She might have to go back on Labour's major promise that we will not hike up income tax. I don't know if she's going to or not, but she's playing with the idea. You're going to say, oh, well, I didn't agree to that. Well, you don't have a say. You only had a say on what they sold you. You don't actually have a say on the decisions. So what is democracy, basically? I get to decide what exactly, whose promises I like. Whether it happens or not is irrelevant, right? Again, and I'm not saying it should be that case. I'm not making a judgment here. I'm just opening up the conversation. When we use these terms like democracy, what do we mean? Because a direct democracy would mean that we would literally have a vote every 10 minutes on every law. That's having a direct say in what your country looks like. But then also at the same time, democracies are wonderful. It's lovely to have a say if everybody knows what the hell they're talking about. Because if you've got a bunch of illiterate 5-year-olds making decisions on how the house is going to be run, everything's going to crumble. And then you always have this tension and balance. Yes, democracy is wonderful, but it also depends on the nature of the electorate. Now we can say, well, it's up to them to decide what they want. So if a bunch of murderers now decided we're going to murder, we're going to say, oh, it's up to them. Where's the line? Where's the line of you ought to have a say or you shouldn't have a say? I'm not putting that there. It's a really interesting conversation in political theory, and many theorists have put forward these ideas and, where, for example, you have disenfranchisement. People can't vote up to maybe 16, 18, right, in various countries. But what about when you hit 70? Yeah, what's the difference between a 70-year-old and a 15-year-old at that moment? Our brains go up and down. Yeah, our views also shift. And if the whole of society is based on the interest of people over the age of 65, say that's your majority, what happens with the young people? Yeah, who are the driving force behind it and paying those pensions?
This was a major talking point in the Brexit vote, wasn't it? That a lot of older voters would essentially...
Exactly. Yeah. So how do we square these circles? How do we navigate these tensions? And where is the line?
Well, you tell me.
Yeah. Again, then this is going to turn into one about political philosophy.
Yeah,
right?
I know. Yeah. We're going too deep.
But you're just touching on things as we're going
But just one more on this, because I do think...
So when you're saying the covenantal order, just to answer your question, where would it be? I think all of these things are contextual. For example, the road to democracy is not democracy in and of itself, but nobody has a problem with that. So, for example, the process of democratization is not democracy in and of itself, but it's making its way there. So speaking of it like that is a spectrum. It depends on where society is. But yes, is the ideal, and that's the point that political theorists make within democratic theory, is the ideal that we all have a say, 100%. But it also needs certain things to get the necessities, such as we are all well informed and highly informed in order to have a view, right? Or in order to have, we can all have a view, but in order to have a view that's actually productive and constructive, otherwise we're just going to go back on ourselves. And that's that tension that the ancient Greek philosophers were having, like Plato, where they talked about democracy in a sense of the tyranny of the masses. Because if your masses aren't of high quality, then yeah, they're going to tyrannize society and everything's going to fall. Whereas at the same time, if everyone is there and are highly informed, now that also speaks to a very famous hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari. Is related by Abdullah bin Abbas. And he's actually relating a story, not story, he was there and he's relating it to somebody. And it was a conversation that's taking place between Abdurrahman ibn Auf, right, a companion of the Prophet, and Umar ibn al-Khattab, whilst Umar al-Khattab is the leader. And Umar ibn al-Khattab hears something to do with voting. Yeah. And what people were saying is, we want to institute an autocracy, because that's how Abu Bakr was chosen, the first leader, right, after the Prophet of the faithful community. And they're seen as stewards. That's the Arabic word, Khalifa, stewards. So he's the first steward to uphold the Covenantal law, right? So the argument went that some people were saying, we're just going to appoint a leader, people don't have a say, because that's what happened with Abu Bakr. Yeah, when they were sitting there amongst the Ansar and the Muhajirin, the helpers and the immigrants, and there Abu Ubaid ibn al-Jarrah was there, Umar was there, and they just took his hand. They said he should be leader. A bunch of people decided, okay, cool, and then everyone else kind of was like, okay then. So they said that's what we should do. Umar ibn al-Khattab was like, no. That was just a very extraordinary circumstance. Like, for example, if your country's at war, you don't have elections, you wait till the war's over and then you have elections. So that was an extraordinary circumstance, but that's not how it should be. People get to choose their leader, right? So he says, I'm going to stand up and tell the people. This is at a time when this conversation took place in Mecca, right, during Hajj. So they were there visiting Mecca for pilgrimage, and then they were going to go back to Yathrib or Medina, right? Abdurrahman says, لا تفعل, يا أمير المؤمنين لا تفعل, right? So, commander, leader of the faithful, please don't, right? Why? إن هذا الموسم, this season, as in the Hajj season, يجمع, right? It gathers رعاء الناس وغوغاءهم, the riffraff and the rabble rousers. Yeah? They will fly off with whatever you're saying. يطير عنك كل مطير. They just fly off with whatever you're saying. ولا يفقهون ما تقول, and they won't understand a word that actually came out your mouth. So wait حتى ترجع إلى المدينة, until you return to Medina. Why? This is how he describes it, دار الهجرة, right? It is the abode of immigration, meaning people fled there in refuge. They're not people who are armchair critics. They've lived it. So they understand the seriousness of a policy. Yeah, this isn't theory for them, right? So one. Number two, they're mature because they've been through an experience. They're just looking for peace and security and stability, right? So it was Dar al-Hijrah was Sunnah. Number two, it's the abode of the prophetic culture, meaning it is highly civilized. That's the place you should be having this conversation. And you will find there أهل الفقه وأشراف الناس, people of intelligent and noble people, right? And they will understand what you're saying. So even that speaking to that tension. So I don't think it's one of those where, oh, yes or no. It just depends on the situation. The reason I've stated this is because this isn't a conversation that's just taking place now. The ancient Greeks were having it, the ancient Arabs were having it, and I'm sure many other societies have been having that same conversation. But this idea that, no, democracy, whatever the weather, well, no, it just depends on where you're at. You might include your children as they get older into conversations about the family. It depends on their age, it depends on their maturity, and it depends on the insights, input that they're going to provide if there's value. Yes, should there be a consultative process? 100%, right? Especially for those people who are stakeholders in the conversation. If not for their opinion, just to keep them on board, right, and bring them on the journey. So the consultation doesn't necessarily have to be because they have anything amazing to say, but it's just a part of emotional management. These are all aspects of good governance and good leadership.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing from you is that we need a more participatory and principled forms of governance, political kind of order, from parts of what you said, and perhaps some of what you're going to say, the average sort of citizen within the country essentially becomes more well informed with better education. So,
100%.
So do you want to speak to education and the issue of or like what meaning? 'Cause I think that is a really a critical one. Education within the neoliberal
This is
order.
a really hard conversation to have because as you're showing, every little point that's
All
made
connects. Yeah.
has
I
a
know it
rabbit
goes off, yeah.
hole and a whole library
Of
and a
course.
conversation
Yeah.
behind it.
No, I appreciate
Yeah,
that.
and
I appreciate that.
we are trying to keep it meta. This isn't me trying to regulate your podcast. I'm just saying for the audience as well. If you want to go down rabbit holes,
Listen,
I'm good to
someone
go.
needs to regulate this podcast, mate. No, but I really think this. I think the education thing is something which it's a big topic nowadays, just from different angles. Even within, let's call it the parameters of a neoliberal kind of system.
So I'm actually going to come to that. So
Okay, fair
when
enough.
we come to that, as in because you asked me to break it down,
Yeah.
right, succinctly, there is a point where we're going to come to
All right,
that.
fine. So we'll
then
come back to
it's
education.
fine, yeah.
All right, we'll park that. Go
So
for
we're
it.
talking about accountability. Sorry, we're talking about political and legal structure here. So within that is also accountability, the neoliberal order, right? Where is the accountability? To shareholders and voters. And voters are treated as shareholders, right? It's not a stewardship. It's a stewardship over how much money you're going to make. Yeah, just that. Whereas in the covenantal order, it's to the creator of the cosmos and the one who feeds you, sustains you, and regulates all affairs across the universe, right? And the order that he wanted enacted for the benefit and the well-being of creation. To your conscience, right? And to community. Now, somebody might say, okay, but you just said the voter. The voter is community. But no, neoliberal order has given us a liberal political system where communitarianism has gone out the window.
It's more individualism.
Yes, so individualistic that there is no community, although you have millions of people living amongst one another. Yeah, and then power. Yeah, the neoliberal order is centralized and technocratic, whereas the covenantal order is distributed. Power is diffused amongst family, amongst tribe, amongst assembly, amongst the court, and so on. Right now, yes, on one hand, when you diffuse power too much, nothing happens. But there is a balance. And everything is about balance at the end of the day. There is a balance to be had. Now, moving on, so we discussed, a worldview, economic philosophy, political, legal structure, anthropology and psychology, right? So how humans look at themselves. What we have is human identity, right? So in the neoliberal order, human identity is based on being what? A consumer, a competitor, and an influencer. There's no surprise of these influences of social media. This is the neoliberal system. This is what it creates. Everyone's competing. Everyone's a consumer, and everyone's trying to influence. For what? For the ends of a neoliberal order. However, in the covenantal order, we're here to serve. I was talking to somebody recently, and we were talking about social groups. And I said, one of the things that the neoliberal order has done to even social groups, everyone acts like a consumer. So you hear people saying, oh yeah, I need to get in a group of like wealthy people, money people. Why? What do you have to offer? Brokey. Yeah, because that's how they see it. I'm not wording like that. They do. All right? I don't want to be with the brokies. I want to be with the rich people. But you're a brokey. So what do you have to offer? But because you're a consumer, you think I should come in a social group which has developed itself to a certain level, and I'm just going to go in and take. Consumer mentality. Not how can I join this group and actually contribute? What's my contribution? And the social groups that crumble, that are toxic, is where everybody's a taker, right? The best social groups is when everybody's a contributor and nobody has any intention of taking. So what can I bring to the table? And there's this kind of, not servant, but there's this contributor attitude. And that's something that neoliberalism kills because it's competitive consumerism. How can I get as much as I can from any given situation? So even a family, that it crumbles because the husband's like, how much can I get from my wife? Yeah. Then the wife's like, how much can I get from my husband? Not how can I provide? And yes, there's going to be sacrifices here, but that sacrifice is for the good of the family and vice versa. And where you hear one spouse complaining, and usually one spouse being very, very mistreated, is because that spouse is sacrificial, but the other spouse is not, is a consumer. Yeah, so they don't actually live by the same values. That's why even these ideas, the assumption automatically, if I'm a Christian, I'm a Christian, you're a Christian. Don't know who the husband and wife is in that situation, but but if I'm a Christian, you're a Christian, that's it, we're done. No. Or I'm a Muslim, you're a Muslim. No. You could still have very, very different world values. And that's why these kind of really superficial modern identities are actually meaningless. The idea of, oh, I'm going to marry this man or woman and we're going to be wonderful together. It's the idea, for example, in America. Oh, we're American, let's get married. No, a Democrat couldn't marry a Republican and vice versa. So just because you're American or you use that title doesn't actually speak to who you are, your worldview and how you operate
You've got to look
the
beneath
everyday
got to
logic.
look beneath the labels, basically.
Yeah, and therefore, if the label is meaningless, why are they even there?
Could you just on that point, on this one point, could you just lay out explicitly what it is about the foundations of this Abrahamic covenantal order that naturally lends itself to a giving, contributing mentality that we so need?
Oh, that's coming to this. The idea of why we're here. If I can, not to regulate order, can I speak to that in a moment? Because those are the bigger conversation on which this comparison rests, essentially. So here, human identity is one as person, a contributor, number one. As a steward, kind of answers your question, but we can go into in a bit more depth if you like. The idea of stewardship. You're not here forever. إلى أجل مسمى in Arabic. For a very short space of time. Okay, it's like you're at a bus stop, essentially. So what are you doing at the bus stop? Oh, I'm just contributing. You know, an old woman wanted to sit down. I got up, or a pregnant woman came along with a pushchair. You know, whatever the case might be. Somebody comes and asks for time. Yeah, this is the time. You know, and so on. Right? What kind of person are you going to be at this bus stop, essentially? So in some case, if this is my local bus stop, as in is outside of my house or it's in my community, I see myself as a steward. I'm there to make sure my community rises. And I mean my community of humans. We're all the children of Adam. كلكم من بني آدم وكان آدم من التراب. Right, the hadith of Abu Huraira. All of you are the children of Adam, and Adam was made from earth. In fact, the Semitic word Adam comes from Udma. In Hebrew, in Arabic, is actually a Semitic language, a Proto-Semitic term, right? It's talking about us coming from earth. That's why also this really bizarre idea that everybody just like dropped out of heaven and ended up on earth is absolutely bizarre. Literally, the name for you is earth. You evolved from the earth. So it's that. Number three, it's about being a witness, right? And what does that mean? What does it mean to be a witness? While at the end of the day, if I'm going to be a witness to something, it means I'm involved in enjoining goodness. I'm involved in actually saying, no, we shouldn't be doing that. Amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar in Arabic. These are political, social concepts. They're not just linguistic terms God is using. But it's that. And then when I'm done, I'll say, well, I did my job. Yeah, I did my job. And this is what they did. So it's a witness on behalf of God. Now, if you're a witness on behalf of God, you're not going to go against what the order of righteousness and goodness that God wants from you. You're just not going to do that, right? Yeah. Otherwise, obviously, you're a hypocrite and ABC. Now, just speaking to that point is the idea that we find in the final revelation about the Sabbath breakers. Yeah. The Israelites, the righteous amongst the Israelites, and then the evil. So the evil, again, pursuing a kind of neoliberal order idea, right? They do things for the market that they're not meant to do, that they're told not to do. So a group comes along and does what? Says, no, we're not taking ourselves down that conceptual pathway. So God says, وَقَالَ الطَّائِفَ مِنْهُمْ. So then a third group comes along. So you've got the first group who break the law, the second group who say, no, we are loyal to God and the order He wants. A third group of Israelites come along and say to the second group of loyal, لِمَ تَعِظُونَ قَوْمًا اللَّهُ مُهْلِكُهُمْ أَوْ مُعَذِّبُهُمْ عَذَابًا شَدِيدًا. What's the point of telling the first group? And this will probably tie in because I conceive of the idea that you're going to ask me, okay, then what's the point? Yeah, because it's so totalizing. But they say, what's the point of telling them? God will either destroy them, yeah, or He will punish them. What's their response to it? No, they say, مَعْذِرَةً إِلَىٰ رَبِّكُمْ, meaning we have an excuse as witnesses to God, we tried. وَلَعَلَّهُمْ يَنْتَهُونَ, and maybe they'll stop. So there is a hope in them not going down this road. What does God say? He said, we destroyed them, except for those who forbade the evil. They weren't. So if you're not against it, if you're either for it or you're apathetic, you're on that side. Even if you're apathetic, if someone says, well, this is not hope, I'm not doing anything. Cool. Then you're with the ones that are doing it.
With us or against us.
Yeah, literally, right? And that's why revelation, not just the final revelation, the proclamation, Al-Quran, but also the Torah, which in Hebrew means the guidance or law, is also characterized as exactly the same thing. God calls it in Arabic, obviously when he's speaking to Moses in Hebrew, it's a different word, but the concept is the same. Al-Furqan in Arabic, the criterion or the distinguisher. It means the decisive line. There is no pussyfooting around it. There is no one foot in, one foot out. I'll put a toe here, play the game, sit on the fence. No, you're either in it, you're either for or you're against. And apathy is against. God's really, really clear. And that's fundamentally what God is saying. That's the message. Yeah, you're either on my side or you're not. And I think if anybody, like Bush tried that nonsense, right? You're either with us or against us. No. God is telling you this. You're either with me, you're loyal to me, or you're just not. And you get to decide on that. So anyhow, that's that. And then education, coming back to your point.
Okay.
It produces skilled labor, and rational consumers. That's what education is about in the neoliberal order. And you and I have spoken about it loads over, not just the past year, in the past as well, being fathers and parents. And when we say skilled labor, it's not just skilled labor. People might think, okay, is he talking about bricklaying or accountancy, finance? Every form of skilled labor is in order to serve the neoliberal order. And if there is any form of skilled labor that doesn't, it's demonized. Yeah, so it's skilled labor, but particularly to feed the system and keep the system in place. In fact, one of the things that you and I have spoken about, given that, we've had an education at quite prestigious institutions, British institutions as well, is that even within it, you can clearly see how they're setting you up for a particular life in order to have a particular function within the neoliberal order. Now, do those things need to be done within any order? 100%. So I'm not problematizing the process. I'm asking the why question, right? It's not about the how, it's about the why question. Because fundamentally what it does, it shapes you to do some things. And it does the what, how do you do it? Even, for example, you did economics and management and stuff. And when I was in my MBA, same thing. We've got a very good view of the neoliberal order from inside. And it's funny because outside of it, when you're trying to do social projects, but you have people from that way of thinking, basically corporate thinking, they actually struggle outside of the neoliberal order to manage a situation or a project that does not reflect a corporate way of doing things. But outside of the corporate world, that doesn't work. Let's just take finance. What is corporate about? Corporate is about managing wealth. It doesn't make money. Entrepreneurs make money. And anyone who's been an entrepreneur knows half of that corporate BS doesn't even work. You're never getting anything on the ground. It's once you've reached a certain place, then there's all that corporate speak and particular structures and ways of doing things. And that's why you'll find a lot of entrepreneurs and business people, they're salt of the earth folk. They understand when you got to cut a corner. They understand you got to take a risk here. You got to do this. It doesn't always come into numbers. There is an entrepreneurial intuition. There's business intuition, right, into doing things. Yeah. Whereas what's corporate about? Let's do some sheets, Excel sheets. Yeah. And then let's look at this risk and this data. No one's denying data is a valuable kind of tool, but there are other tools as well that reflect everyday life. Your data might tell you, that the difference between an accountant and a management accountant. An accountant will tell you where you came from, but your strategist, management accountant, tell you actually how do you want to proceed. They're not the same thing. But the neoliberal order, in terms of education, it is framing you for that. And I have many people who are godly, who are faithful to God, amongst various religious groups, and everyone laments, we don't want our children to get sucked in it. But they overlook the idea, why do you want your children to get 3 A stars or 5 A stars? So that they will get into the best institutions that will train them the best for the neoliberal order.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's that.
So
however,
the way I would summarize that is that it very much sets people up for a consumer mentality and a receiver mentality, and takes away that kind of creative, productive sort of mentality.
That's one thing. When you look at the Covenantal order and what it's doing with education, it also exposes other things. So, for example, it forms character. The whole point of information and knowledge is to make you the best version of yourself. The best version of yourself doesn't just come down to how many pounds you've got in your wallet or bank account. It's how you deal with the world around you, what kind of, like us, fathers you are, husbands you are, friends you are, contributors to the social good you are. And the more information you have, there's a difference between information and knowledge. Information is your data set. These are the variables. Knowledge is how you've put them together to construct something, right? And intelligence is, or wisdom, whatever you want to call it, is the degree, is the skill of how effective you can make that, right? And how efficacious that fundamentally is. That's what education is about. Now, that's not to say skilled or skills for skilled labor isn't in that. Of course it is, but that's not all it is, right? Because you could be an amazing bricklayer or an amazing accountant, but the whole world hates you, and beyond Excel sheets, you produce nothing of good in the world. I'm sorry, you're an ignoramus who just knows how to count. Yeah, that's not knowledge, right? So that's one. And it's interesting because like Arabian political philosophers, we're talking about Spain here, yeah, like Ash-Shatibi. Yeah, Shatibi is a village now called Zativa, right? So Ash-Shatibi, a very famous political philosopher in what people call Islamic Spain or the Iberian Peninsula, we're talking about 1,000 years ago, he discusses the nature of knowledge and its purpose and meaning in the book he wrote, Al-Muwafaqat. And in it, he says, like, Al-ilmu madhinnatul intifa. The point of knowledge is that it is the locus of what? Benefit. And because he's talking about law and politics, social benefit. Of course, there's the individual benefit. If you have all of this data but you can't help yourself, then it's useless. And if you have all of that but you can't help a situation, you're useless. That's why, going back, Ali ibn Abi Talib, for example, the fourth, steward of the covenantal law, right, from the Ishmaelites, that's what he said. He said the benefit of a man is what he can improve. Yeah. Now, this isn't the kind of neoliberal kind of in the pursuit of maximization, right? No, it's about a situation that speaks to people and the physical world around us. How can we improve a situation? Not as consumers, but as stewards. And a steward is somebody who's not looking for self-gain. How can I help you without it actually adding anything to me? And then Iqbal saying, how can I help you without it adding it? That's a really healthy situation. Toxic is, what can I get out of Iqbal? Okay. Yeah. So then there's that. So the summary there is fundamentally, as in from that point, neoliberalism, it inflates your ego and it empties the spirit, the human spirit. Whereas the covenant humbles the ego. And that's one of the other problems. Because now you're a consumer and you think you've got rights, that's where the modern fragility and hypersensitivity come from. Whereas if you're a giver, if you're covenantal, think about it, you don't catch feelings. I'm not saying you'll like everything. There's a million things I don't like. I have very particular corporate skills. So if anything, I'm speaking against myself here because I'm really good at maximizing those things. I just choose not to, right? But the neoliberal, if you can work really well in the neoliberal order, it works for you. But there is a problem with it. So he's a bit like, for example, Shu'aib, right? The Midianite, right? When he says to his people, Salih says to his people as well, right? I'm not trying to tell you something that doesn't go for me. This is me speaking against myself here on this one. In uridu illa al-islah mastata'at. But what we want is islah. And the idea of islah and fasad, right? Constructivity and productivity, as in a good situation, as opposed to ruin and decay, is a massive concept in covenantal order, which we'll come back to in a moment. But fundamentally, there are, like in the hypersensitivity, just touching on that, and the fragility of the age, it goes back to this idea: I'm a consumer, I've got rights. You got to speak to me as a seller in a way that I like. Otherwise, I'm not buying your product. But I'm not here to sell you, as in. Leaders aren't there to sell them something. We're here to help and nurture you. Like a kid, sometimes you don't like doing homework, or you don't want to study this, or you don't want to train like this, but it's for your good. A parent has no self-interest in the child's education. That's you. I just want to see you do well and flourish, right? It comes from love and a sense of humanity. And Allah speaks to this. God speaks to this, right? And what does He say? He says, bear witness for God. وَلَوْ عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِكُمْ. Even if it goes against yourself. So that's that part of stewardship. Now there's also a global and environmental vision, just to go through that quickly for you, right? So what's the neoliberal order? Resource to exploit. Everything is a resource to exploit. Whereas the covenantal vision is what? We are stewards of God's resources so that everyone gets what they need. Yeah? It's not about lots, it's about contentment. So that also speaks to the nature of leadership and humans being cultivators and nurturers. Stop telling people the more you have, the happier you'll be. More and happy aren't necessary. They don't necessarily correlate, and they're definitely not causative. Because there's many people out here with lots, and they either want to kill themselves, so they've got like suicidal ideation, right? Or they're absolutely miserable in depression, taking chemicals in order to regulate it. So the notion actually is of what is contentment and how do we emotionally manage ourselves. The covenantal order speaks to this. The neoliberal order doesn't. Because in fact, the more you manage emotions and proclivities and impulses, the less of a consumer you become. Because you have less need for more. And what you're actually pursuing doesn't cost anything. That doesn't speak to the neoliberal order. So not only is it not interested in that, it seeks to undermine it. That's my point. The world we live in isn't. When I say it seeks, I'm not talking about this just the people who are driving the neoliberal order, right? And we can talk about who they are, and they have existed from time immemorial that God has spoken to. So that's that. So that's nature, globalisation, homogenized markets and cultures. So all of these shu'ub wa qabail, nations and tribes, the diversity of God's creation on earth is just decimated into just homogenization. But as there's a guy, his name's Professor Galloway, right? He's quite well known. You see him on social media and stuff. I saw a clip of his recently, and he's writing what he's saying. What the neoliberal order, he doesn't call it the neoliberal, but that's what he's speaking to. It's made everyone, we're speaking with hyperbole here, but many people, and we're seeing it as a problem. People talk about incels and, red pill and this, that, the other. On the other side, people talking about the woke. What they mean is the blue pill people and so on. My point isn't to make a value judgment. This is just to talk about things as they are in modernity, as in how people are describing them. But he was like, basically, it's leading to people who are asexual because men are so scared of women. Women that don't exist. Obviously, if you're going to have a podcast with 6 prostitutes there, they are women of the neoliberal order. Like, as in, they are exemplifying what the neoliberal order wants them to be.
Is that an episode suggestion?
I'll leave that to you. Don't come in that. But literally, you have you have people like Andrew Tate and others, right, who are there sitting around 12 prostitutes and asking them views and then saying this is women. Personally, I find that deeply offensive. Because are you trying to say my wife is like that? Are you trying to say my daughters are like that? Are you trying to say my dude Iqbal's wife and daughters are like, excuse me? That's beef. No, if that's your world, and if you're a pimp and you want to hang around with prostitutes, that's your business. Don't impose that on the nature of people on earth. That's just a very corrupt section. But obviously, social media amplifies things and takes the 0.001% and makes that out to be the 99. So then the young men who are watching it are thinking this is what women are like. No. These are what corrupt minds are like. And I don't even blame those 12 prostitutes, to be honest, in the sense that I'm sure there's a journey in how they got there. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to behave like this or think like this. They've been conditioned in a world that they're in to end up in that situation. When I say I don't, they how they're doing it, whether it's OnlyFans and XYZ, no girl wakes up at 3 years old and says, I want to be an OnlyFans person. But you do find young girls at 11 saying that. What's conditioned them to do that? Social media. Who runs social media? Who's allowing those kind of views to be perpetuated? For example, Instagram is the worst place, the research shows, for teenage girls to be in, which is why nearly every child psychologist says, keep your daughters off Instagram until they're at least 18, right? Or 16 to 18. And even then, I would argue, even for grown adult women, there are issues for men as well. I'm just speaking to that at the moment. Just don't be there. It's a horrible place to be. It will not help you flourish in any way. Now, one will say, okay, but it's neutral. It's not neutral. It's there to pull you down, to strip your humanity of you, to make you a consumer, right? And think about it. They go after women because even in business, things that women pay for is more expensive than things that men pay for. Women's deodorant is more expensive than men's deodorant. Everything around women is so commoditized, and then the prices are pushed up. So it's more expensive to be a woman than men. And therefore, they attack women as consumers because they want them to spend. So anyhow, you've got that. Then sustainability. That becomes an optional branding exercise just to sound good. ESG and all of that kind of stuff, right? In the neoliberal order, but in the Abrahamic order, that is a sacred, a deep duty as a human being, right? Because corruption of the earth, fasad fil ard, it's a crime. is fundamentally a crime. So there, in terms of global environmental situation, you find that. So I'm just making sure I've covered that. Yeah. So in that sense, that's you see a comparison, right? And the summary is there: neoliberalism wants infinite growth on a finite planet, whereas the covenantal model, it wants balance, continuity, and reverence for what God has created, and reverence and gratitude to the Most High for those things. And then lastly, the human problem, yeah, that each is trying to solve. Neoliberalism, inefficiency, literally. Whereas the Abrahamic tradition, the covenantal order, is what? Unfairness and decay, fasad, things going bad. Like in Arabic, the word fasad is like when you got an apple, yeah, and you say fasadat at-tufah, so the apple is decaying. You imagine it's got worms in it, it's turning green, like it's turning gangrene and all sorts of nastiness, whatever it is, yeah. That is basically what it's speaking to there. What's the solution? Neoliberalism, free markets and competition. We're going to solve the problem by doing more of what caused the problem in the first place. Yeah, whereas the covenantal order is what? God's guidance, yeah, a fair order, and how that guidance tells you that fair order should generally look. And then your different cultures, whether you're British, French, Australian, Japanese, Pakistani, Ethiopian, whatever the case might be, within its cultural makeup and how your civilizations have existed for centuries, if not millennia. And what's the metric of success for neoliberalism? Your GDP, your innovation, your consumption. Yeah, and what's the innovation for? For more consumption. How can we make more money? How can we make a better commodity in order for what? To drive more revenue, more sales. Yeah. Whereas in the covenantal tradition, it's about human flourishing. It's about trust. It's about goodness in a way that brings up society and helps them to flourish holistically. Because I know we've discussed before as well the idea of self-help and all of that stuff. So fundamentally, the crisis of the neoliberal order, and this is coming around to it, you've got material abundance, yeah, but then you've got existential emptiness. Just robots eating food. You're just robots going to work. And in the home, you're just robots. Everyone's sitting around a dining table with iPads and phones in your hand. You're not just doing that because that's the culture. It has created that scenario. This idea that it's outside, not in my house, it's like gas. It's like sarin gas. It will seep in. You cannot stop it because you're being conditioned. You wake up in the morning, like think about it, people have children in this neoliberal order. I'm not problematizing it. We're all part of it. I'm part of it, right? Or I've been conditioned into it, socialized as we grew up in primary school, secondary school. Those people who've managed to come out and be kind of, on the edges. Right, what's the word? Being, sorry, it'll come to me. But being people who are on the edges and they're not a part of it, it's a very hard place to find yourself, meaning it's a fight to get there, right? But if you can, it's brilliant. But anyhow, it's material abundance, existential emptiness, efficiency without fairness, connectivity without community, yeah, freedom, but no responsibility, yeah, because everyone could just do what they want, how they want. So as a result, what do you have? You have lots of material carbon-based matter kind of things or digits on a screen, but you have no meaning. Yeah, work becomes busier, your homes are lonelier, and your politics is emptier, right? That leads to what? Mental health epidemics, loneliness, populist anger, right? Why? Because the human spirit, and the one who created the human spirit knows how to feed that human spirit and make it flourish. Yeah? Neoliberalism is about exploiting it, exploiting what it can from the human spirit. So what you end up with, or as we can then conclude, the human spirit cannot be optimized by the logic of the markets, which is what neoliberalism is. For the covenantal order, markets are tools. No one said get rid of the marketplace. But markets are tools, they're not God. It's not a God, right? It is not the constitution. The state, the government, they're meant to be trustees for human flourishing, not for the market to flourish. And that's, let's be frank, many governments. There is an irony when David Cameron, wants to criticize the Nigerian government for being, they're very corrupt. Didn't COVID show us about corruption that all the conservative friends got? How many billions? And now who's having to pay all of that back or trying to, gap that kind of that debt now? Corruption is corruption. Just because in some kind of colonizer mentality made corruption look civilized doesn't stop it being corruption. Yeah. But here the government and the state is meant to be trustees, right? Not masters. So now we're talking about authoritarianism, as we're seeing the British government turning towards. Yeah. People have a spirit. They are souls. They're not units of consumption, right? And the law is meant to serve life and human flourishing. It's not that lives serve the law of the neoliberal elite. That's fundamentally where you see this transcendent horizon. Yeah. And of course, it's rooted also in the idea that everything we do is answerable. You don't get away with it. You can believe you get away with it. Good for you. كلا سوف تعلمون. Trust me, you'll come to know and then you'll see. Yeah. So in one sentence, the neoliberal order, it liberated consumption, hawa, desires. And Allah says this, right? Have you seen he who takes his desires as something to be served? Yeah. The neoliberal order liberated consumption, but it enslaved conscience. Whereas the covenantal order liberates conscience, right? And it disciplines consumption. And that's fundamentally as an overview. And I know I took long to go through it. But as you showed, even if you just take one little word in all of that, this is much more of a topic. And as I was saying to you just before the podcast, this is probably one of the hardest conversations to have, not only in the public realm, but on a podcast where you're limited, because you are talking about reality as it exists. How do you do that? Yeah. So I'll leave it to you now. You take it where you want.
No, look, that's been really, really useful. And even though it took some time, I think that was powerful on many levels. I think, firstly, because even though it's a difficult conversation, like you said, it's a conversation whose time has come and is absolutely necessary. And frankly, I think one of the, there's the phrase, I think it's in the 13th chapter, وَلَا يَحِيقُ الْمَكْرُ السَّيِّئُ إِلَّا بِأَهْلِهِ. I always found that very, for the Buddhists out there, it's like the idea of karma, basically, right? What goes around comes around. Literally, it's like the boomerang sort of effect, and so the translation of that, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially, the work of evil will not go around except that it comes back on itself, essentially. And so people are now witnessing the results of all of this, and I think what's really interesting is that a lot of that diagnosing process, has been happening, right? So there's most of what you've said in different parts, and even though this was a very powerful way to show how the final proclamation-based, Quran-based, Abrahamic covenantal-based, call it system, order, code, really provides a bedrock of the solution that is required. Elements of all of that, let's call it maybe, intuitively, right? People have then they just naturally have seen, right, that this is an issue, this is an issue, that's an issue. Like you correctly said earlier, different people are looking at it at, different components. But actually, a lot of the people who are now have been proponents of this notion of, the polycrisis and the meta-crisis, and certainly there are attempts, at least, to certainly do exactly what you've just done very helpfully, which is to look at a much more comprehensive solution, but also, and I think just to the point earlier, one thing I'll just add to something you said right at the beginning, which was that actually those who speak of the idea of meta-crisis is not just actually interlinking all of the external things, but one key thing that I found very interesting is that even for people who don't necessarily come from Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Abrahamic tradition, they still have identified that the issue really here, all of these external manifestations of problems are fundamentally results of some sort of internal psychological or psycho-spiritual kind of
they even use the term
issue.
spiritual.
Right,
yeah.
exactly, right?
Yeah.
So meaning the meta for them is not, meaning it goes...
it's not just material.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
It's in the psyche of the human being, or at that kind of soul level, as you've spoken of. Okay, so no, I think, look, the outline I think was really powerful, and I think hopefully for those, I think this helps make the point of what the actual, the power of revelation, when you really look at it, as a way to address, the actual the issues of the day, meaning that what it really contains, and it's sometimes, it's funny actually, because sometimes I feel like it's difficult for a lot of people to see that, because a lot of people will read even in their own language, right, in translation, beginning to end, and they'll look at society and they'll look at the text. It's like, to the extent that we think of it as a map, right? Sometimes, I mean, I remember this from back in the day, with Duke of Edinburgh, right, award when I was doing the hike, right? I mean, I'd look at the map, I'd look around me, I'd think, like, mate, I'll leave it to somebody else, honestly, to figure it out. Right? It's a little bit like
Yeah.
that, right? You can look at the map's correct,
Mm.
right? But the situation's so damn confusing that you can't even see half the time how to map it.
And I think there's also the notion of perception here, right? And framing. If you're picking up, and when I say like the final, people might ask, okay, if you're talking about such a primordial tradition that spans from today going back 4,000 years, why are you talking about only the final revelation? I'm not. I'm actually, the Arabic word, as we discussed before, al-kitab means the decree. And God uses that term in various contexts. When he's talking about the decree often, he's talking about the actual decree of God in the covenantal law, the covenantal order. Why covenantal? Because that's where it started with Abraham, a covenant to uphold this. And if you read the Old Testament, right, or you want to call it the Tanakh, the Torah, in the book of Exodus, Moses is given literally the Ten Commandments and the book of the covenant. Now, of course, there will be people who come from the final revelations point, right, and say, oh, there's no covenant there. Again, it's framing. It is their friend. In fact, nothing has changed. Even when God says, and this is just, I guess, to help people bridge this idea that the Quran is saying something completely different, even though Muslims rhetorically will say, oh, no, but it's the same. Is it? Show me. Oh, I can't. In fact, that's why everybody usually, let's be frank, let's talk about Muslim practice here when it comes to final revelation. They skip the first third. It doesn't make sense to me. And let me go to Yasin, because I like the way, because everybody recites it in my culture. Or my favorite surah is Ar-Rahman, the merciful. Why? Let's be frank, because it just repeats over and over again, and it sounds phonetically, at least there's a bit of familiarity to you. But in fact, one would argue the first 7 chapters, 9 chapters, that whole thing is known as the long 7. That's actually the most important for framing how the rest of it goes. And just to give, just your views, I'm not telling you this, but your views and understanding of the final revelation. The final revelation, number one, it calls itself musaddiqan. Yeah? What does that mean when it's saying it is a musaddiq? Oh, it affirms. No, linguistically that means affirms, but in the context is saying this is a continuity. Yeah, God talks about, for example, the Jews, Christians, and says to them, this is a musaddiq, this is a continuity. God's not telling them to be another religion. In fact, وَلْيَحْكُمْ أَهْلُ الْإِنْجِيلِ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فِيهِ, right? Let the people of Jesus' good news judge by what the good news was. Yeah, let the people of Torah judge by the Torah. That means then this chapter 5 to chapter 1, 2, 3 is all the same. And not only is it the same, some people like Muslims will say, oh, but it's not what they have now. No, it's what they have now. Yeah, it's the Torah and what it has now. It's the gospel and what it has now. It's just a matter of, like you were saying a moment ago, it's about, do you know how to read it? Because my fundamental argument, and I know this through lots of research and anecdotal experience. When I say anecdotal, I'm like a social scientist. In that for the past 20 years, I've been asking thousands of people. So it's, like any social scientist would go, I just haven't written the paper on it. Yeah, but I've done it. I've done the research, done the engagement. Muslims don't know what's in the final revelation. And I say that as a general. I'm not talking about specific 1 person, 2 person here. But generally, they have absolutely no idea. Because the neoliberal order has done a number of things. One, it said that you have a religion that started 1400 years ago. Its founder is Muhammad. Okay, you're Mohammedans then. Yeah. Number 2, do you know how many Muslims, Iqbal, they have a problem with me saying Abrahamic tradition. Why does it have to be Abrahamic? And then you have this absolutely bizarre delinquent response. You do about the Abrahamic records. Why? Because you heard the word Abraham, so you're just tying into everything you've ever heard before. But the fundamental problem is you've never read the actual final revelation, or you've never understood it. Why would an intelligent, let's talk about the intelligent people, why have they read something and not understand it? Because the neoliberal order and the secular order, which is self-secularism, has framed what that is to you. So when you look at it now, because you've predetermined what it is, you're not taking it on its own merit. You're trying to reading it, you're looking for what you think it is. So it's a religion, it's a book, it talks to Muslims. Muslims don't even exist in it. It starts off, think about it, it starts off with the opening, 7 verses, cool. Then you have chapter 2, which is what? The heifer. As in substantially starts at chapter 2. You have an introduction, and the heifer, al-Baqarah, or the cow, is actually the first major chapter now. That chapter, number one, what is the heifer? I'm just going to use this as an example. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I would happily do so, right? The heifer or the cow is what? Is a ritual, is a purification ritual of who? The ancient Israelites. What's the whole chapter, which is the longest chapter in the final revelation? What's the whole chapter about? The first half is castigating disobedient Jews and what they did. Going basically is just a repeat of Exodus. Then from around, I think, verse 120 to 141, it's explaining to those people there is the Abrahamic tradition. It's explicit. This is not my language. It's God's language, right? وَقَالُوا كُونُوا هُودًا أَوْ نَصَارَى تَهْتَدُوا. They say be Jewish or Christian, you'll be rightly guided. So there's this big conversation about what is true guidance from God. قُلْ بَلْ مِلَّةَ إِبْرَاهِيمَ حَنِيفًا. Say no, it is the tradition of Abraham. You don't say no, it's the new religion called Islam, right? Or it's about being a Muslim. It doesn't. But yes, do those Arabic words linguistically exist in the conversation? They do. But I just feel it's a delinquent conversation. It's like God saying, in the Prophet, the story with Joseph, a sayyara came along. Oh, look, a Ferrari. No, in modern Arabic, maybe sayyara means a car, but a sayyara just means modes of vehicles, and it's talking about caravans that were passing by. In the same way where God's talking about those who are submissive to God. And who are they? God describes them very early on, right? When the Jews and the Christians say, if you're Jew Christian, you will go to heaven. God says, Tilka amaniyuhum. These are just baseless desires. Why? Where does the Torah talk about Jews? They didn't come, that wasn't even an identity until the Babylonian period. So God says, that's rubbish. Christians, where is Jesus preaching Christianity? In fact, the bizarre situation is that what you have is a rabbi who's an Israelite teaching the Torah in synagogue, and then imperial Roman Christianity comes along, turns a rabbi into God. So who do Christians worship? A Jewish rabbi. Broski, even if you believe God became a Jewish rabbi, wouldn't you become Jewish? Clearly, that's the exemplar here. Oh, we should follow Jewish rabbis. So where does Christianity now come from? Just the logic of it is absolutely bizarre. Yeah. Oh, no, but it's about what happened after him. So, okay, we'll reject Jesus, the Jewish rabbi, and we'll just do some random stuff, right? And even then, they don't know the history of how the Messiah's legacy turns into Christianity a couple of hundred years later. But my point is, Muslims are of the same ilk. So they've created a new religion as well, right, in modern forms. And I don't homogenize. You have people talk to me about Islam. I'm saying, no, there's Islams because there are different groups of people with very varying views, to the extent that one group of Muslims will say they're not Muslim, and this group will say they're not Muslim. Who becomes the arbiter?
But that's true within any of these named religions.
100%, right? But then who's the arbiter? Oh, the Quran is. But bro, you don't see the Quran like he does. So the question is, how do you see the final revelation? What is the appropriate way? It's very simple. We agree, rationally, everything is about context. If we agree that the final revelation is the last chapter of a 2,500 year conversation with God and the Semites, right? Then it's contextualized by what came before it. That's where context is in its immediate and what comes before it. It seems Muslims are completely removed from that. They contextualize everything also by empire, but existing empires in the Near East and around it, not only just the Abbasids and Umayyads, the Arabs that preceded, but also the Persians and the Turkic Persian kind of empires that came across. And they become the arbiters. And in that, you have like the development of a new Judaism, a rabbinical legal tradition that everyone just stuck to and ossified with. But then that's the criticism that you have of the Jews. Rabbinical Judaism. It's like a pot calling a kettle black. Now, going back to Revelation, because the lens has been shaped and framed, even in a language they understand, like English or French, they're still just not getting it. It's completely lost. And people say to me, you talk about covenantal tradition. Where did God say that? You're like, have you not read what I read? وَإِذْ أَخَذْنَا مِيثَاقَ بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ. Right, we took a pledge from them. So you know the idea of pledge there. Then you know the pledge that the companions of the Prophet took, meaning the Ishmaelites took. And God says, we took a covenant, al-ahd. But that's not being translated. So these notions that are very much a continuity of conversation, it's the same conversation as in the concepts, precepts around it, are there in the Arabic. But you're being swindled, Western Muslim. You're being swindled by your translators, by your preachers, by this new identity, right? That was shaped by who? Western colonialism that needed to put you in a census when it subjugated certain parts of the world. And you just became this ethnic identity, and it's lost. So when people say to me, oh, how can all of us go lost? I'm like, but you claim that about other people. This is what I don't get. Muslims say, are you saying that millions of Muslims aren't getting it? Are you saying billions of Christians aren't getting it?
Sure, absolutely, yeah. But when I've thought about this, and I get exactly what you're saying, but I've always wondered to myself, it just feels as though the guidance often feels inaccessible then, somehow, like just in practical terms. I mean, we can talk theoretically about how it isn't really, but
how
in
can
reality,
it be if the book is right there in front
no,
of you?
but this is the thing though. Like this is the
But it's
kind
not inaccessible. What we're saying is because of people's commitment to the neoliberal order, because of their commitment to their ethnic identities, because of their superficial commitments to their ethnic communities, they've decided to make it inaccessible to themselves.
So we need to take responsibility for it, essentially.
100%. And that's the thing, right? You can't sit there as any one of these religions and claim the other religions people are going to hell when you're doing the same thing, right? You can't say, oh, because I say that to people. Like Muslims will say to me, but okay, Christians, they're going to hell. No, Christians can be faithful where they don't know anything better. Why?
But creed alone is not going to save you.
Yeah, creed doesn't save you, right? And not only that, think about what God says about people of the book, Ahli Kitab. And he's talking about Christians here, right? When the new revelation comes to them, when I'm saying the update comes, and they're like, okay, cool, this is the next thing God wants us to do. What do they say? Why would we not follow this? وَإِنَّا كُنَّا مِن قَبْلِهِ مُسْلِمِينَ. We have been submissive from before. We've always been that type of people. It's not a religion. Muslimin here is talking about people who are submissive by their nature to God, meaning loyal. We've always been loyal to God. So if this is what God wants me to do now, I'm down, right? Think about it. If they were illegitimate, why would the Prophet and God tell us in the final revelation and in the hadith of Abu Hurairah, the Prophet's telling us as well in Sahih Bukhari Muslim, that somebody who is Ahli Kitab, who are faithful and loyal to God, they are rewarded for that, and then they're rewarded for updating as well. If it was wrong, does the pagan get that? No. So clearly, it's about being faithfulness, covenantally faithfulness, that fidelity to God, right? If you don't know, you don't know. And if you do know, that's a different situation. Then people say, oh yeah, but the Quran has reached them. I'm not cousin, the Quran hasn't reached you. Clearly, right? And if your arguments for Islam are the ones that you think are going to be compelling, sorry, they're not. Yeah, I say this as somebody who studied the law for 20 years. Muslim arguments for Islam are preposterously stupid. Yeah. And that's why, let's be frank here, if this is like gold, then everybody in the Western world and the whole world should be down. But they're not. And I'm sorry, this idea, again, there's some ethnic supremacy in it. Oh, it's just because they're all just misguided and they all follow their desires. Cousin, you're sitting in the neoliberal order with them. You're not training your children to do what they're training their children to do. Don't give me all this, what, you're better than them. Why? Because you were born with a bunch of phonemes and rituals. You sit there saying words you don't understand, blabbering sounds, then telling me I get a spiritual feeling. The Buddhist and the Hindu does the same thing. So then why are you suddenly morally better than them? You see, when people don't look at themselves and actually think, again, it's the pot calling the kettle black. What's the difference between you two? You're using Arabic, they're using Sanskrit. You're using Arabic, they're using ancient Phoenician Hebrew. Cool. You're using Arabic, they're using Latin. Is that it? Your language is superior. And then lo behold, the Muslim views about language being superior. Arabic is the most superior language. That's why our phonemes are better. It's just a conversation that's so dysfunctional and spiraling. Then, am I going to now, as a population, take you guys seriously? No, I'm just going to laugh. And it's so wrapped up in your ethnicity that even when I've spoken to people, they said, I'm down with everything. I don't want to be a Muslim. I said, I'm not calling you to this modern Islam. They said, yeah, I don't like spicy food. I don't want to dress like that. Because that's fundamentally what it is today. Now, we can sit there. I've said preachers, well, that's not true. While he's sitting there, Pakistani dressed like an Arab. Cousin, why are you cosplaying Sinbad for? You live in Britain, you want to talk to people, but you are undermining it. Now, don't get me wrong, culturally, when I'm in Arabia, I wear a thobe. If I'm in Japan, I'll wear what they're wearing. When Rome do as the Romans do. I love culture. So this isn't a xenophobia conversation. But if I've got a job and I'm turning up to work, for example, I'm a doctor, I'm going to be in scrubs. If this is a job and a mission that you've got, you dress appropriately for the mission, you speak appropriately for the mission, you behave appropriately for the mission. But when you've got ethnic cultural interests, that's a completely different story. And that's why I always tell the faithful, look, we all have, nobody's acultural in the world. I'm a Londoner, right? But you have to decide what takes priority in a given situation. And if that means you have to go against yourself, walau ala anfusikum, then it is what it is. That's where your fidelity and your loyalty to God really comes through.
Somebody who's heard all of this, and I'm conscious of time and just closing off in the last sort of 15, 20 minutes or so, by, well, maybe putting a close bracket on this part, which was definitely helpful, but then going back to that compare and contrast, especially as you did it, and then bringing it back now. So anybody who's heard all of this just says, okay, whether they are, again, from, have sort of grown up and functioned as a Muslim or as a Jew or as a Christian or as a, none of the above, but they are now very much interested in, I suppose, starting again, right? Just revisiting now and say, okay, fine, let me clear the slate here. Let me look at God, Revelation, the covenant, all of this afresh. A bit more eyes open to my current sort of the situation which I'm in.
Talking about
exactly. No, but
you talk about Muslims. You talk about Christians, Jews.
No, I do appreciate that the answer to a certain degree, right, is going to depend on who specifically, right?
Yeah, because their starting point isn't the same.
Fine, but at the same time, but let's to the extent that
I actually think. By the way, when I say that, I think Jews and Christians have a better starting point than Muslims.
Fair enough. But to the extent that a person, to the extent that they, and I know that this is partly theoretical, but I think for the sake of time and simplification, we're going to have to do it to a certain degree, which is to say, there's it's like that Men in Black scene, right? When they put the thing and they press the thing and you can't you forgot everything that you had before. So blank slate. I really would like you to speak to what are the practical steps that a person can start to do to start to rebuild essentially their worldview and practice in a way that is actually meaningful and in a way that is, say, resists the current status quo, whose problems we've talked about, and critically starts to build the alternative. Because whilst everything you've spoken of, it will resonate with many people as to what this alternative looks like. Roughly speaking, the road from at an individual, familial, community, and then a kind of more societal level to a better end state, which I know is a big conversation and something we'll have to fully perhaps another time. But if you could really break down in the last 15 minutes or so, like what those steps look like. Basically, what does someone who's watched this who says, you know what, I like this narrative, I think there's something here, what do I do now? So what do they do?
So those are two different things, right? Because I'm not gonna BS people, and we have to be clear. Whilst this is a hypothetical question, you can't remove it from reality, and you can't. You're asking for a practical solution in a vacuum. That doesn't make sense, because the whole point of a practical solution is within a context.
No, in reality,
right? In reality, so let's have a real conversation. Number one, check your community. Check the people you're about, who you hang around with, where you're taking your information from. Whether that's social media, whether that's your preachers, whether that's your local temples, whatever temple, Christian, Muslim, Jewish temple. So that's the first point. You do have to see that, because you are not a product of a vacuum. You are a product of society. You've been conditioned, you've been socialized, not only with information, but into ways of thinking, not just by the neoliberal order, but by your ethnic community, by your ethno-religious community, whether that's white, black, pink, blue. Whether that's Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Hindu, right? You are a product of something. So there is a level of introspection. Number two, we're talking about change then, because you're not just in a vacuum and you weren't just born. So then it's how much are you willing to change? And it's about also asking two questions. One is about the neoliberal order. Are you willing to go against it? How invested are you? Or is it one of those where the pain point isn't that deep, so I can just live with it? It's okay. Or are you invested in another way? You, if you're a family person, definitely for yourself, your family, your children, the next generations. And then number three, it comes down to also where we're talking about this, because none of this exists in reality without whom? The one who created reality. What level of loyalty and allegiance and fidelity do you have to the creator of the cosmos, whom you're going to meet in about 10 minutes, right? And to what he wants and the order. The first place is introspection. The second place is then shaping perception and your framing. How do you see reality? We can talk about it all day today. People can. I'll be surprised if anybody was interested, because I'm a boring person. But if people are watching it, then they're like, oh, okay, that's an interesting video. No, cousin, we're not here to have videos and just to have talk. And it's not edutainment. What you're going to do, it's about a movement. How do we create, for those people who have that fidelity to God, right? irrespective of your background, your ethnic background, your religion. Religion was only created a couple of hundred years ago, right? But whatever modern identity you have, throw that all out the window. Yeah, let us get primordial with this in a way that actually reflects most of humanity for most of its existence, not just the past 100 years or 300 years, depending on what you're looking at. That is a social movement, a group of people who come together, who have shared views and shared values. That doesn't mean we're all robots. In fact, that's not only boring, that's also corrosive to human nature. We're not all robots, but we all have a similar direction. There has to be a political culture amongst us where we know how to agree, how to disagree, but fundamentally get over all of that and actually move forward with unity and purpose. Yeah, there's that social movement element. That's the steps. And that starts off with the change of perception and advocating the covenantal order. Before that, we could say, okay, so once I get into my business and I'm selling stuff, how do I do accounting? That's a step 4 conversation. Before we get there, what are we selling in our shop, right? Who is the target market? What is the market segment that we're going after? X, Y, Z. Once we know that, then it's like, okay, we should advocate this. We're going to do, what do they call it when they ask people, seed fund, right? Then you're looking at seed funding. Then you get the money. Then we can talk about organizing. Yeah. Then we can talk about, doing something more kind of physically in terms of you do this, I'll do this. But that's a step 5 or step 4 conversation. Step 1 is, what is my perception of the world? Now, someone will say, oh, where do I go to get this perception of the world? Join my message board. Yeah, the Telegram message board, if you can drop them a link. Yeah, sure. That's a good place to start the conversation. There's already over 1,000 people there, right? Again, I haven't been doing this in public, right? As you know, you're the one who forced me to come in. Like, this is the first major podcast I've ever been on, right? And but that's not to say you haven't been trying for 10 years. I'll give you that. But the point is, yeah, so that's a place. I do teach, but put that aside. I'm not here to sell you anything or sell anyone anything. But just the message board is absolutely free. Go and you see the development of these ideas. That can be a place where you're socialized. I'm not sectarian. See, the thing is, I evade all of the sectarianism, whether it's within Judaism and it's liberal, conservative, or whether it's Christianity, Roman Catholics, evangelicals, Protestants, Anglicans, Methodists, or whether it's Islam, whether it's the Muslim, Sunni, Shia, Salafi, Brelwi, don't care. Because I'm not even operating at that level. I'm not even operating on these modern religious levels. I'm going back to the primordial way, which is what God calls to in the final tradition. Jews are making claims, Christians are making claims. God's like, go back to the forefather Abraham. Yeah, the Ishmaelites don't even need to make claims because you have the pagans who are talking about their forefathers. God's like, go back to your true forefather, Abraham, Ishmael. So the starting point for this conversation in the context of the final revelation, explicitly what God says is that's the starting point. I didn't choose it. God chose it, right? He's using those terms, right? قُلْ صَدَقَ اللَّهُ فَاتَّبِعُوا مِلَّةَ إِبْرَاهِيمَ حَنِيفًا. Say, God has spoken the truth, so follow the tradition of Abraham who was Hanif. Yep, that's what it goes to. And if you read everything in that context, whether you're reading the Torah, I'm not saying there aren't issues. Yeah. Or, the Gospels according to, there's an issue there. But those people of intelligence, the people we rely on, that's why I said, go and look at your leadership. They should be able to give you a coherent narrative of this is the conversation. Therefore, this is what God wants for us. And then if they're strategic leaders, they should be able to help people to organize in how do we effectuate that for our good, the good of future generations, and the good of everyone around us.
You mentioned earlier the importance, other than introspection and checking your kind of networks, essentially, you mentioned the importance of developing and really kind of seriously questioning ourselves as to, are we loyal to God? Are we really committed? Do we have that allegiance? Someone might think, well, I'm trying, but probably, if I'm true to myself, it's not really quite there. Mm-hmm. But then what can they do to develop that? What develops that commitment, that loyalty, that allegiance, that sense of that trust and connection that becomes an unbreakable bond?
That's a brilliant question. And it goes back to the conversations we always have about atheism and XYZ. And hopefully, having spoke about this, people will understand my very brief answer here. These aren't issues within the covenantal order. These are neoliberal problems. And they are provoked because of neoliberalism. It's an entire framing. When you start to look at not God as a real, I'm going to use the term just for popular reasons, a real person, i.e. the existence of something real, right? When it's just a nice idea, pie in the sky kind of thing, then obviously it becomes part of myth, and it's like then it's a questionable
Yeah,
conversation.
an actual being.
Yeah, when you're talking about an actual being, an existential reality, as God says, ما يكون من نجوى ثلاثة إلا هو رابعهم. There aren't more than 3 people except that there's 4, and there's not 5 except he's 6th, and even 6th, 7th, and 8th, 9th, and so on. So when you start to see, and that's what God's point is, stop forgetting that I am here. Yeah, as God says to Moses and Aaron, "Inni ma'akum," I am with you, right? Or he says that in other, and he says in different wordings in other places. Yeah, so or there he says, "Inni ma'akum," I am with you both, right? And God says it to the Israelites as well. Think about in the era of the 12 judges, "Inni ma'akum," I am with you. So God is, right? When we're using the English word God, fine. You want to use the Semitic term Allah, right? Whether it was the Hebrews that used it, the Arabs that used it, the Aramaic speakers used it, Phoenicians use that exactly same word. It's just a Semitic term for the one to be served. Okay, who is who? Malik. It's a Hebrew word, an Arabic word, and an Aramaic word. The king. Right? And at Surah Hashr, you see God actually characterizes his kingship. Quddus Salam Mu'min Muhaymin Aziz. I'm not going to translate it, but
No,
for those
sure.
people. But fundamentally, yeah, it comes back to that. These questions are being provoked by a framing of reality. They're not even questions otherwise. And I have like those people who've kind of like joined certain things that I've been teaching, whether they're conferences, seminars, and so on. As obviously I have more time than a podcast to just unpick that one point. Literally by the end of it, everyone's on the same page. Ah, I see. That's why you end up having doubts. Doubts don't exist in reality. It is or it isn't. Because if there's a coherent sense of reality, for example, right? I've never been to Jamaica, Barbados, the Caribbean. Do I doubt it exists? No, but you've never seen it though. But you can see pictures. But you could have made up the picture. AI could have made a picture. How come these methods of skepticism don't apply to everything else of knowledge? Because we've been taught this. Operate with everything as you do with everything, right? The undifferentiated whole. So if we're going to sit there question the creator of a cosmos, an entire narrative that makes sense of human existence and the events that have led up from then to now, that's more cohesive in my life and more coherent than the idea Jamaica exists. That's just a random isolated idea. There's more reason for me to doubt Jamaica than all of that. But you see, our framing has put this in a realm of the mythical. And they did that in order to, I say the elites and the architects of neoliberalism, they did that for what reason? Fundamentally, so that we would question the obvious. And when it's dysfunctional and everything turns on his head, the boy doesn't know whether he's a girl, the girl doesn't boy, the man wants to get married, doesn't even know if women exist like that, X, Y, Z, they don't know why they exist. Again, the removal of every structure. Now, and I'm not saying all structures are good, that's not my point, but the removal of all frameworks means you're left with nothingness. And that's where humanity is finding themselves.
Yeah, I understand what you've said. But my question was more about the actual, not so much the, let's say, the doubter or the atheist, but more like the disconnected theist, right? So let's say the person who isn't in two minds about whether a creator or God exists, but feels a disconnection, and so
that disconnection comes from a lack of knowledge, though. They don't know the narrative, and I'm sympathetic to the idea. We've been discussing this, which is basically a library, and we're trying to do that in however long this podcast is, right? But fundamentally, when you think about it, you're asking me basically, this person isn't sure what's going on because they don't know the narrative. If you're like, let's be frank here. If you're like, okay, is that what you're saying? Who do they go for the narrative? Come to me. Cool.
I thought you might say something. Yeah.
I help you.
No.
There you go. Yeah? Like you're saying, where should they go for £10? Come, I'll give you the tenner.
No, so fine. £10.
What else I'm going to say? Go to him?
£10 for everyone sounds good. Like universal basic
I wish
income.
if I had it, I would give it.
But what about? I thought you might speak to the role of, for example, I thought it might be a nice way maybe to close off, like the role of salah as an activity of connection between the human being.
How can you, when you're just standing there bowing your head, going, to you it sounds like that because you don't understand Arabic. In fact, what does Allah say in the final revelation? لا تقربوا الصلاة وأنتم سكارى حتى تعلموا ما تقولون. Don't come to salah, when you are inebriated. Why? Or until what? Sorry. You know what you are saying.
Yeah.
The vast majority of people who do salah in the Western world who do not understand Arabic are doing exactly what? Doing what they do not understand they are saying. People don't even know what salah is.
Yes,
Yeah?
what you're saying essentially is that without this broader narrative and a deep understanding of
It's
it,
not just that,
you
the
can't.
whole thing is what is true of Islam is also true of modern Islam, obviously, is true of everything in the world today. Everything is dysfunctional. So whilst things are ticking along, the economy is ticking along, the education is ticking along, religion is ticking along, that's all it's doing. And all it is a continuity of a facade. That's the problem today. Whereas the righteous, the faithful, they are people of substance. And God tells us, and maybe because I know you're looking at the time, ظهر الفساد في البر والبحر بما كسبت أيدي الناس, right? So this ruin, this decay is now setting in across the seas and the land, meaning everywhere, because of what people have wrought with their own hands, meaning as a consequence of their actions. Why does God do it? ليذيقهم بعض الذي عملوا. Let them taste some of what they've done. But look at the last point. وَلَعَلَّهُمْ يَرْجِعُونَ. But perhaps they will learn from it and come back. So is there the scope for change as expansive and totalizing as the neoliberal order is today? And yesterday was another order. I'm not saying it's always been this, and tomorrow might be another one. But that's it, game over? It's never, because there is always the possibility of ruju', of coming back to the order, the fitrah, the natural inclination of humans, and the order that God wants for our own human flourishing.
Okay, I think we'll leave it there. Nice to know. Nice to end on a note of confidence,
of hope and restoration.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Even though it does seem it seems difficult, because these are dark times. I mean, there's no doubt about
100%.
that. But we amongst others, I'm sure you'll help to lead people into the light. So, Godspeed, brother.
Thank you.
I'll sort of tally along the back somewhere with a microphone
And a sandwich.
A ham sandwich if things are really bad.
yeah, literally, you're on the precipice.
All right, cool. All right, thank you so much. Until next time.
You're welcome. Thank you, sir.
Amazing. We'll cut there. Brilliant.
Cheers, man. Thanks, Tom.
Cool.
Sorry,
Very
thank you,
interesting,
sir.
that one. I was enjoying that one.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
So what are you saying, Tom? Declare.
Are you joining the resistance, Tom?
Yeah. Very interesting.
Declare the oneness of God now, brother.
You can keep that in the podcast. I haven't cut yet.
Brilliant. Then you have to. You have to.
All right. We'll do that.